Aloha, and welcome back to the channel. I'm glad you're here. This episode is about the surreal and how we can bring it into our photography. First, let me say that I've never had a class on photography, I've never taken a workshop, and I've only read half a book on how to take pictures. And the reason I've only read half a book is because the photographer author about halfway through was talking about a sunset or sunrise that they had taken, and they said in Photoshop they moved the sun to a more desirable location in the frame. So at that point I closed the book, threw it away, and no more photography how-tos for me. However, I have had a class on art, and the class was, I believe, sophomore year at Ole Miss. The title was Modern Art or 20th Century Art, and I can honestly say that that class changed my life. I began to see things differently, think differently, see my place in the world differently, and most importantly, from that class, I began to create my own art. About halfway through the course, I went home, got my dad's old Minolta 35mm film camera, and began taking pictures in and around Oxford, Mississippi. After the class, I had the opportunity to go to Glasgow, Scotland to study. And before going, my dad and I went to a camera store in Nashville, and I bought my first camera. Well, actually, I paid half and my dad paid half. And this is the camera. It's a Canon Rebel G 35mm. I've had it for 29 years, I guess. I probably haven't used it in 15, but I still have it, and I'm glad I do. As for the art class, I remember being especially moved by the Italian Futurist and the Surrealist. The Italian Futurists sought to incorporate aspects of speed and dynamism, movement, in their paintings and sculpture. There's a famous painting of a little dog walking on a leash, a little dachshund, and its little legs are just moving so rapidly. This painting is called Dynamism of a Dog on a Leash by Giacomo Balla. It's a classic Italian Futurist painting. There's also a famous sculpture by Umberto Bocciani called Unique Forms of Continuity in Space that shows a figure striding forward with such implied speed that it appears as if the armored warrior is melting. I thought these two works in particular were just fantastic. The Surrealist doctrine, as espoused by André Breton, of the desire to create an art combining elements of dream and reality, really made an impression on me. And the reasoning was that these aspects of dream and reality could spur the subconscious or stimulate the subconscious to ask the individual to wake up the subconscious so that the individual would then perhaps see the super real, or as he termed it, the surreal. And according to Breton and the surreal is not just a fantasy. It's not merely a dream. Rather, it incorporates these elements of the fantastical and visionary to point to something that is actually the most real, the super real, the surreal. In this way, Surrealism challenges us to know, or challenges us to question what it is that we actually know. I was completely blown away by the Surrealist works of Max Ernst and Joan Miro. I was inspired by the strange and evocative landscapes of Yves Tanguy and Salvador Dali, and the dreamy scenes of Magritte made me smile. And considering how much I enjoyed that class on 20th century art all of those years ago, it's probably of little surprise then to know that I'm always looking for ways to bring the surreal into my nature photography. I want to consider today ways in which we can communicate these dream worlds and landscapes of the super real. How can we spur the subconscious and challenge the conscious mind to question what it is that we actually know? And I think this is really important for our photography because we're not just taking pretty pictures of pretty things. How can we do all of this? Deal with elements of dream, of fantasy, of the fantastical and visionary. How can we communicate this in our photography, in camera, and not in post, because this is something that I believe is of the utmost importance. The Surrealists felt that their art pointed to the super real, not the super fake. So, how can we effectively bring in the surreal? How can we effectively incorporate elements of the surreal in our photography? What is it that we should look for in our compositions? And what is it that we as photographers, what can we do to embrace and communicate aspects of the surreal? Well, I believe we can do this in 4 different ways, at least 4. And if you know of others, or if you have ideas of others that may spur the surreal or bring the surreal into a photography, please comment below. One way that we can do it, and I think the first way, is photographing what I call locations that challenge. And by photographing locations that are unique and unlike areas that we would commonly see in our day-to-day, bring in an element of questioning. We challenge ourselves with this landscape because it is so new. And we actually end up asking ourselves, what is it that we're actually seeing? Is this lava? What made these forms? What made these lines in the landscape? Was it erosion? Was it volcanic activity? Was it the wind? Was it water? Was this area once underwater, like say Utah perhaps? So those are ways we can bring in the surreal, just by going to locations that challenge. A second way to bring in the surreal is through experimentation. The Surrealists love to experiment. They love to play around, and this kept their art spontaneous and playful. And I think that's something that we can bring into our photography. When we're out in the field, feel free to try stuff, just to see what happens. If I do this, this happens. And the Surrealists love to experiment. They love to play around, and they just felt that this experimenting could bring about truth and beauty through chance. So that's something that we can bring into our photography. When we're out in the field, invite the serendipitous. Feel free to just try stuff and see what happens. The third way that we can bring in the surreal or incorporate aspects of surrealism in photography is through element of time. Now, photography in many ways is the special relationship of time, light, and space. So this aspect of time, key to the Italian Futurists as well as to the Surrealists when we think of the nature of dreams, the nature of remembering, what brings about the subconscious. How can dreams and memories last through time, as it were? And one way that we can show time in our photography is through long exposures, especially long exposures with subjects that are moving. For example, the dog in the Italian Futurist painting, or in a lot of my photography, water. And how can I photograph water and moving even in daylight? How can I express these long exposures? Well, neutral density filter certainly helps. This is a 10-stop ND filter. It's by Lee, no relation. These I find really useful in bringing aspects of the surreal into my photography because it allows for long exposures. If you'd like to see a tutorial on ND filters or how I use these out in the field, let me know in the comments and I'll be happy to make a video for these. So with the time and elements of long exposures in daylight, we can also bring in aspects of the nightscape. Of course, the relationship to dreams is evident. So, long exposures at night, bringing in the Milky Way, the night sky, and seeing what happens. And when we look at surrealist compositions, we often see these vast landscapes with a lot of empty space, negative space. So that's something else that we can bring about in our compositions to bring in surrealism, is photographing with emptiness, with empty space, negative space, giving room for the subconscious and the imagination to roam free in these very wild landscapes. And lastly, the element of juxtaposition, bringing together disparate elements and connecting them in ways that before maybe we hadn't seen or had not realized. This juxtaposition of unique or unusual placement of elements within the frame that stimulate the connection or affirm the relationship of hitherto considered disparate entities, events, or phenomena. So we can look for occurrences that are out of the ordinary, occurrences that ask the viewer to consider what's going on here. Okay? And as a nature photographer, I believe that it's my duty to take photographs and not make photographs. So that's to say, when I'm out in the field photographing, I'm taking what comes. I'm taking that element of experimentation and spontaneity. And if something presents itself, great. But maybe I need to use my creativity in composition to bring these elements together, of these elements of juxtaposition. I'm not going to introduce something new to the landscape. So remember, juxtaposition with spontaneity, I think, is important for the surrealist nature photographer. And again, all of these ways to bring in the surreal, juxtaposition, time, photographing locations that challenge, implementing experimentation and the serendipitous, all of these can bring the super real to the viewer and do so in a way that really makes them wonder what's going on. It's like the Bob Dylan song where he sings, "Something is going on here, but you just don't know what it is. Do you, Mr. Jones?"